The day Harlem held its breath. In the long memory of Harlem, there are days that pass like gentle songs drifting through open windows, and there are days that carve themselves into history with fire and silence. The morning this story begins was neither loud nor dramatic. It rose softly, with sunlight spilling over brick buildings and shop signs, with the smell of fresh bread mixing with car exhaust, and with people stepping into their routines unaware that a turning point waited only hours ahead. For years, Harlem had lived in the shadow of powerful men. Some wore suits, some wore uniforms, and some wore smiles that hid more than they revealed. Among them stood Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, a name spoken with both fear and respect, a man who had learned to survive in a world that offered little mercy to boys born on the wrong side of history. Yet this is not his story, at least not at first. This is the story of the woman who stood beside him, who watched, waited, learned, and one day decided that silence was no longer her role. Her name was Mayme. To the outside world, Mayme Johnson was a quiet woman with careful manners and an elegant way of carrying herself. She dressed neatly, spoke softly, and knew how to keep her eyes lowered when conversations turned dangerous. Many mistook her calm for weakness, mistook her kindness for ignorance, and mistook her patience for fear. They did not know that patience, when stretched long enough, becomes something else entirely. It becomes resolve. Mayme had not grown up dreaming of power or conflict. She had dreamed of classrooms filled with children, of books stacked high on wooden desks, of shaping young minds instead of surviving among ruthless ones. Before she met Bumpy, her life had been simple in the best sense of the word. She believed that hard work and honesty could build a future, that love could soften the rough edges of the world, and that justice, while slow, would eventually arrive. Then she met Bumpy Johnson. He was not the monster newspapers painted him to be, at least not in her eyes. He was thoughtful, intelligent, and carried himself with a dignity rare among men who had known too much struggle. He loved poetry, spoke of philosophy, and treated her with a tenderness that surprised even him. Yet he lived in a world governed by violence and power, a world where alliances were temporary and enemies permanent. Mayme entered that world not by choice, but by love. At first, she told herself she could remain separate from it. She would be the home, the quiet refuge where Bumpy could set down his armor. She would keep her distance from the deals, the threats, the whispered names. And for a time, that worked. Harlem accepted her as Bumpy's wife, not as part of his empire. Women nodded politely, men tipped their hats, and no one spoke openly in her presence. But silence has a way of gathering weight. Years passed, and Mayme began to notice patterns. The late-night phone calls that ended in tense silences, the bruises Bumpy explained away as accidents, the sudden disappearances of people she had met only once who never came back into their circle. She learned to read the unspoken language of danger, the pauses between words, the glances that lingered too long. Still, she remained quiet. Then came the man everyone called Vincent Moretti. Moretti was not from Harlem. He arrived from downtown with polished shoes, perfect hair, and a smile that never reached his eyes. He represented a powerful Italian syndicate that had decided Harlem was too valuable to leave uncontrolled. Where Bumpy negotiated with respect and balance, Moretti negotiated with threats and humiliation. He believed fear was the only currency that mattered. From the moment Moretti entered their lives, Mayme felt the air change. He visited their home uninvited, sat too comfortably in their chairs, and spoke to Bumpy as though he were a servant rather than a rival. He complimented Mayme in a way that made her skin crawl, with words sweet on the surface and sharp beneath. And slowly, subtly, he began to press. First, it was business pressure, demands for larger shares, for more territory. Then it became personal. A friend of Bumpy's was beaten badly after refusing to cooperate. A local shopkeeper who once greeted Mayme warmly closed his store overnight and vanished. Rumors spread of children threatened, of families warned to leave. Harlem began to whisper again. Bumpy resisted as long as he could, but the weight of Moretti's influence grew heavier by the week. Meetings ended in anger, deals collapsed, violence crept closer to their doorstep, and with every passing day, Mayme felt the walls of her carefully built refuge begin to crack. She tried to speak to Bumpy, gently at first, then with growing urgency. She told him that Moretti was not like the others, that his ambition had no limits, that sooner or later he would come from more than territory. Bumpy listened, truly listened, but he believed he could still manage the situation. He had survived too many storms to fear this one, or so he thought. Then, one evening, everything changed. Bumpy did not come home. Hours passed, then a full night. Mayme sat by the window, watching the street, counting the footsteps that were not his. Fear crept into her chest like cold water, slow and relentless. When dawn arrived without him, she knew something was wrong in a way she had never known before. By mid-morning, word reached her through a trusted friend. Bumpy had been detained, not by the police, but by men connected to Moretti. It was not an arrest, not an abduction in the traditional sense. It was a message. Moretti wanted obedience. Mayme felt something shift inside her then, something old and quiet giving way to something fierce and awake. For years, she had believed her role was to wait, to hope, to endure. Now she understood that waiting would only cost her everything she loved. She did not scream, she did not panic, she did something far more dangerous. She thought. Mayme had spent years observing the rhythms of this world. She knew where people met, which streets were safe, which restaurants were neutral ground. And she knew one more thing, something few suspected. She knew how to protect herself. Long ago, before Harlem and Bumpy and all the shadows, her father had insisted she learn to handle a firearm, not because he expected violence, but because he believed a woman should never be entirely helpless. She had hated the lessons at the time, hated the noise, the smell, the weight of the weapon. But she had learned, carefully, precisely, and she had never forgotten. Now, for the first time in her life, she considered using that knowledge. She dressed that afternoon with unusual care, choosing a simple blue dress and a hat that shaded her face. She looked like any other woman stepping out to run errands, calm and unremarkable. In her purse, hidden beneath gloves and a handkerchief, rested a small, well-maintained pistol. Her destination was not secret. Moretti liked to lunch at a cafe on 125th Street, a public place where he believed himself untouchable. He enjoyed the attention, the sense of power that came from being seen. To him, safety meant visibility. To Mayme, visibility meant opportunity. The cafe was busy when she arrived, filled with businessmen, couples, and clerks on their lunch breaks. She chose a table near the window, ordered tea, and waited. Her hands were steady, though her heart raced with a clarity she had never felt before. She was not driven by rage nor by revenge. She was driven by a single, unwavering thought. This ends today. When Moretti entered, the room shifted almost imperceptibly. Conversations lowered, eyes followed him briefly, then turned away. He spotted Mayme almost immediately and smiled, the same cold smile she had learned to hate. He approached her table without invitation, as he always did. "Mrs. Johnson, what a pleasant surprise." She returned his smile, gentle and polite. "Good afternoon, Mr. Moretti." They exchanged small talk, the kind that hides more than it reveals. He spoke of business, of weather, of how dangerous Harlem had become. He hinted subtly at Bumpy's situation, at how cooperation could make problems disappear. Mayme listened. Then she stood. In a motion so smooth it barely registered, she reached into her purse. What happened next would be retold in whispers for decades, distorted by fear and legend. Some said she shouted a warning. Some said she prayed. Some claimed she hesitated. The truth was simpler.
She looked Moretti in the eyes, steady and calm, and fired. The sound echoed like thunder in the small cafe. People screamed, chairs scraped, dishes shattered. Moretti collapsed, wounded but alive, his perfect composure replaced by shock and pain. Blood stained his immaculate suit, a vivid reminder that power, no matter how great, remains fragile. Mayme did not run. She placed the pistol on the table, straightened her hat, and waited. Within minutes, police arrived, followed by men who understood far more than they admitted. She was taken quietly, her face pale but her posture unbroken. Harlem buzzed with disbelief. A woman, the wife of Bumpy Johnson, had openly challenged the Mafia and lived to tell the tale. But the true shock had not arrived yet. Within hours, Bumpy was released. No charges, no explanation, just free.
The long shadow of courage. Time, which so often softens the sharpest wounds, did not erase the memory of that day in Harlem, but it transformed it into something quieter and more enduring, like a deep current beneath the surface of the river. Weeks turned into months, months into seasons, and the city slowly learned how to live with the story it had inherited. The cafe where the shot had been fired reopened, polished and repainted, yet people still lowered their voices when passing the window where history had paused for a heartbeat. Children who had not been born when it happened grew up hearing fragments of the tale, half legend, half warning, and even those who pretended indifference carried a subtle awareness that the balance of power in Harlem was no longer what it had once been. Bumpy Johnson, for all his experience and instinct, found himself navigating unfamiliar territory. He had spent his life mastering the language of deals, alliances, and controlled intimidation, yet now he sensed that something more delicate and unpredictable was shaping his future. The respect he received had deepened, but so had the expectations placed on him. People no longer saw him merely as a figure of authority. They saw him as the man whose household had challenged the Mafia and lived. With that perception came an invisible burden, the unspoken demand that he now stand not only for strength, but for restraint, not only for influence, but for protection. He responded not with speeches or declarations, but with subtle changes in the way he conducted himself. Meetings grew calmer, negotiations more patient, and disputes more likely to end in compromise than in quiet violence. He still understood the realities of his world and did not pretend to become a saint overnight, yet he began to draw clearer lines between necessity and cruelty, between leadership and domination. Those who dealt with him noticed the difference, though few could name it. They simply sensed that the man before them was guided now by more than survival. Mayme watched these changes with a quiet satisfaction that she never expressed aloud. She understood better than anyone that transformation, if announced too boldly, often invites resistance. Instead, she encouraged Bumpy through small gestures, thoughtful conversations, and the steady reminder that power, once tempered by conscience, becomes something far harder to destroy. Their home, once merely a refuge, gradually became a place where plans for community improvement, educational support, and neighborhood protection were discussed alongside the usual concerns of territory and profit. Joe Louis remained a distant yet influential presence, his fame carrying him across the country, his victories in the ring echoing far beyond Harlem. Yet he returned often enough to maintain the fragile bridge he had helped build between ambition and responsibility. His visits were never official, never announced with ceremony, but always meaningful. He spoke with pastors, teachers, shopkeepers, and young athletes, reinforcing the idea that strength could serve something greater than personal glory. In private conversations with Bumpy and Mayme, he shared his own struggles, the weight of representing more than himself, and the constant effort required to remain true in a world eager to shape him into a symbol rather than a man. Meanwhile, far from Harlem's streets, Vincent Moretti rebuilt himself in a different way. The wound in his body healed quickly, but the wound to his pride lingered like an ache that refused to fade. He withdrew from direct involvement in Harlem, choosing instead to expand elsewhere, where his authority remained unquestioned and his name still carried the old fear. Yet he never forgot the lesson he had learned in that cafe. He became more cautious, more observant, and paradoxically, more restrained. He learned to look not only for rivals with guns, but for the quiet figures whose loyalty and resolve could alter entire empires. Years passed, and the era that had shaped all their lives began to shift. New laws emerged, new leaders rose, and old alliances slowly unraveled under the pressure of changing times. Harlem itself transformed, sometimes gently, sometimes painfully, as waves of progress and displacement reshaped its streets and its people. Through it all, the story of Mayme Johnson endured, evolving with each retelling, shedding details and gaining meaning. In some versions, she became a fearless warrior, in others a tragic heroine, in still others a symbol of love strong enough to defy fate. Mayme herself listened to these stories with a faint smile, recognizing fragments of truth, but knowing the essence of courage rarely survives untouched by imagination. She devoted more of her life to education, eventually helping establish small scholarship funds and mentorship programs for young women who, like her younger self, believed that quiet determination could change their destinies. She taught them not how to fight, but how to stand, how to speak, and how to recognize the moment when silence ceases to be wisdom and becomes surrender. Her lessons were never dramatic, never sensational. They were practical, rooted in experience, and delivered with a gentleness that made them all the more powerful. Bumpy, growing older and more reflective, began to think seriously about legacy. He knew that history rarely paints men like him kindly, and he accepted that truth without bitterness. Yet he hoped, in some small measure, that the years following that pivotal day might soften the edges of his story. He supported community projects more openly, funded clinics and cultural programs, and intervened discreetly when violence threatened to spiral beyond control. These acts did not erase his past, but they shaped his future, and in the quiet accounting of his conscience, that distinction mattered more than public opinion. The true test of their transformation came during a crisis that threatened to undo everything they had built. A new syndicate, ambitious and ruthless, began to probe Harlem's boundaries, testing its defenses, searching for weaknesses left by Moretti's retreat. They believed the neighborhood ripe for conquest, its leaders softened by time and sentiment. Tensions rose, rumors spread, and the old fear returned, creeping back into the corners of daily life. Many expected Bumpy to respond as he once would have, with swift and brutal force, to remind the world of his reputation. Instead, he chose a different path. With Mayme's counsel and Joe Louis's quiet support, he convened meetings not only with his own allies, but with community leaders, clergy, and business owners, forging a united front that blended influence with legitimacy. They used political pressure, legal maneuvering, and strategic alliances to block the syndicate's advance, cutting off resources, exposing vulnerabilities, and forcing a retreat without a single public act of violence. It was not a perfect victory, nor a permanent one, but it demonstrated something revolutionary in its own quiet way. Power, when guided by conscience and community, could defend itself without devouring those it claimed to protect. When the danger passed, Harlem exhaled. People spoke not of battles or bloodshed, but of cooperation, of resilience, of a neighborhood that had learned to guard its future with more than fear. And at the center of that story, as always, lingered the memory of a woman who had once stood alone in a crowded cafe and changed the course of events with a single, unwavering choice. In the evenings, as the city lights flickered on and the noise softened into distant hums, Mayme sometimes sat by the window and reflected on the strange path her life had taken. She thought of the girl who dreamed of classrooms and quiet dignity, of the woman who loved a complicated man, and of the moment when love demanded courage she had never imagined possessing. She did not regret her choice, though she understood its cost. She had sacrificed anonymity, safety, and simplicity, yet in return she had gained something rarer than peace. She had gained purpose. And in that purpose, woven into the evolving fabric of Harlem's history, lay the true legacy of her life, not as a figure of violence, but as a reminder that even in the darkest systems, the human spirit can rise, redefine power, and leave behind a shadow not of fear, but of hope.